There are many today in our world who would say the answer to that question is no. Noted atheist and evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins has called the Bible, quote, fiction, myth, poetry, anything but reality. Bible minimalist and archaeologist Israel Finkelstein has claimed Bible history did not take place either in the particular era or in the manner described, and some of the most famous events in the Bible clearly never happened at all. We live in a world, and my heart is with youth and youth ministry, and so I know that our young people are growing up in a world that increasingly says you can believe in science or the Bible, but not both. And if you believe in the Bible, and believe that it's true, and believe that it's historically reliable, you're really an idiot. That's the world that people are growing up in today. What we would like to do is we would like to show, through our speakers, that there are good answers for some of the claims that we make, good reasons for that, as well as some good answers that have been thought out that provide a pushback against some of the things that have been critical that have been said about Scripture. This question, can we trust the Bible, I believe is of utmost foundation and utmost importance to us because our very faith is based upon the truth claims within this book. And so today, we will explore together the question of can we trust the Bible. Here's how it's going to go. This morning, we're going to look at that question from a scientific perspective. We have two scientists who will speak to us this morning. And then after lunch in the afternoon, we're going to look at that question from a historical perspective. And we have an archaeologist here and an apologist who will be presenting. And then we'll finish off talking a little bit about the church and what the church can do to help prevent people leaving the church and leaving the faith. John will talk to us about that. And then we're going to finish the day with a panel discussion. Now, if you have questions on any of these particular sessions that you hear, we welcome you to submit them. We won't be taking questions from the floor during the panel time. You need to pre-submit those questions. And so you can do that if you want to do it the old school way. You can do it with a pen and paper. There will be a little basket out there and some blue slips of paper. Write your question on. If it's a question for one of our speakers specifically, would you please put their name on it? If you are high-tech-ish, you can submit your questions on Facebook or Instagram. Now, I'm primarily talking to two groups of people. If you're a teenager, you're probably going to put it on Instagram and you're looking for Ready Answers Conference. That's where you're going to go. Follow us there. You'll see this picture. Just comment your question. Again, if you are directing it at a specific speaker, please put the speaker's name there so that we can consider that in our Q&A. And because Facebook is now a place for old people, that's why the teenagers aren't there anymore, you can submit your question on Facebook if you want at our Facebook page, Ready Answers Apologetics Conference. Again, look for this logo, type your question in the comment section, and that's how we'll get it later. Just a couple of other things. The bathrooms are located out down this hallway on the right if you need to use them. During break times, we will have break times in between our sessions for you to get up and move. They're not long break times. If you're going to slip out to look at the booths, and I encourage you to do that. We'll promote them after the next in the next break. Please do that, but be quick, and particularly with our break time where we have coffee and snacks, we just ask that you be quick, take your coffee, suck it back fast, and then get in here for the next session. That's how we're going to do it. And finally, we value your feedback. In your conference guide, the very last page is a survey, a feedback survey. And we would love to have some feedback on this conference and how we can improve it. You can just tear that out and there'll be a basket at the back that you can put them in. Or, again, if you're high-tech, you can go to our website, readyanswers.ca, and you can take the survey very quickly through the link that's at the top, and it takes it 3 minutes. That's what SurveyMonkey tells me it will take for this particular survey. So 3 minutes. If writing it out by hand is too onerous for you, you can do it online that way. All righty? Are you ready to get started? All righty. Our first speaker this morning is Dr. Kirk Durston. Kirk is an apologist with power to change, and he spends his time writing and speaking and interacting with this concept of science and theology and philosophy and how they interact with each other, particularly within the context of authentic Christianity. Kirk and his wife Patty live in Wallenstein, Ontario, but he's no stranger to this area. Kirk married a St. Joe Island girl, and he's back up in this area regularly. Kirk earned his MA in philosophy from the University of Manitoba and his PhD in biophysics from the University of Guelph. I know he's an avid reader of scientific journals, and he's concerned with the corrupting influence of scientism, which masquerades as real science. He's going to speak to us about that this morning, so please join with me in welcoming Kirk to the Ready Answers Apologetics Conference.
Yeah, so my area of specialty is information that's encoded in the DNA and what it does in terms of protein structure and so forth. There's digital information in our DNA, in fact, all the DNA of life, and I'll be mentioning a little bit about that shortly. But let's begin. We're really, the weekend theme is can we trust the Bible, and this morning, can we trust science? And so I want to look at a couple of things here, just with regard to that. I want to begin with just a few quotes from the Bible and what their implications are. First of all, it says in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so we have a statement, very first verse in the Bible, we have a statement where God is claiming or stating that he actually created the universe. And so we, right off the bat, have the possibility that the universe is not a result of some natural process or been caused by nature, which is always a bit of a problem. A woman cannot give birth to herself, and so it would be very difficult for nature to give birth to itself. That would be a circular fallacy. But right off the bat, we have that this is a miracle, and secondly, in the book of Job, and some scholars believe that the book of Job is one of the oldest, or if not the oldest book in the Bible, and written maybe around the time of Abraham. And in that book, God is talking to Job, and he's asking him a series of questions just to underscore the point that Job maybe doesn't know quite enough to be able to know what God should and should not permit. So he asks Job a lot of questions, and one of them is this: do you know the ordinances of the heavens, or fix their rule on the earth? And it's very easy just to read that and just can move on to the next verse without realizing the massive implications. For an ancient writing, this is shocking, because many ancient societies just thought, for example in Greece, prior to the time of Socrates, that the gods were behind everything. Every lightning bolt, every tree, every rock, anything that happened in nature was the gods that were doing it. The concept that there were laws of nature that governed the world is thought to be a relatively modern concept, the foundation of modern science. But what we're having here, what we see here, is not only the statement that there are laws of physics that govern the cosmos and the earth, but that God is the origin of those laws. God is the creator of the laws of nature, which makes God the very foundation of science, because he is the origin of nature and the origin of the laws of nature that govern nature, and this is one of the foundations of science. Third, great are the works of the Lord. They are studied by all who delight in them. And the point that I want to make here is that science, properly practiced, is a noble and godly pursuit. It is a pursuit that God loves us to do. Properly done, properly practiced. And just as a quick definition, when I think properly done, I'm talking about sticks to the scientific method. Sticks to the scientific method. So we might come back a little bit to that, but that's scientific method. You can all Google that. It's quite simple, but I'll just move on for now. So there is very good science, and properly done, it's honoring to God. It moves one to worship God. So what I suggested is that God is the foundation of science here. And the reason that I'm saying that is that God has created nature, and he's created the laws of nature, which make science possible. Without laws of nature, science would be impossible. So science is contingent on these laws, and the laws themselves were contingent on God creating them. Secondly, the scientific method, rather than science in general, is our tool to understand nature. So when I talk about 21st century science, that includes a lot of other stuff we're going to see shortly, other than what I would call experimental science and the scientific method. But the experimental science and scientific method is our tool to be able to understand God's creation. So some people will say, well, if you believe that God created the heavens and the earth and the laws of physics, you're not even going to do science. Well, no, I know lots of Christians who follow Jesus Christ and they do science, and why is that? Because just because I believe that God has created the world and created the laws of physics, that doesn't mean I automatically don't study what He created. That actually moves me to study what God created. It's actually an act of worship. If you really love someone, you think highly of someone, and then you find out that they're an artist, what's the first thing you want to do? You want to, well, let me see your art. Let me see your creation. And here we have God is the artist behind the universe. And therefore, if you love God, you will want to study what He has done in different ways. There's all sorts of different ways to study what He has done. And so what I'm suggesting here is that God and good science that adheres to the scientific method, those are mutually compatible. Not just compatible, they're mutually enriching. And in my own experience, it moves me to worship God. And it grieves me when I see science, what 21st century science has become, and I'll explain that shortly, but it grieves me because I see that human nature, when you get humans involved, human nature tends to corrupt things that they're involved in. So we have this beautiful tool, good science, scientific method, and it slowly has become corrupted over the past, say, 100, 150 years. So just by way of preview, I divided this into two sections. There'll be section 1, and I want to warn you, this is going to be kind of a negative section. It's going to be disturbing to you if you have put your complete, unquestioning, blind faith in science. You're going to find this first section disturbing. And people will say, oh, this is anti-science. No, it's only anti-bad science. It's very pro-good science. But yet today, what the people believe is science has become a mix of a lot of stuff that's not so good science. So that's going to be the negative. It's going to be disturbing, and it's going to be quite disturbing to some people, because you know how it is when you have a deep religious conviction, and then suddenly somebody challenges you on your deep Christian religious conviction. When I was a teenager, before I'd even had a chance to think through this, there's this emotional rush, like, what are you talking about? And you can sometimes react quite strongly and defensively against because they just challenge your deeply held religious conviction. But I have seen that same religious conviction being held by people when it comes to the trustworthiness of 21st century science. And I've seen people get red in the face, lose it, start yelling, scientists, when you start challenging or exposing that, hey, this isn't all 100% good science here, there's some problems here. And but it's good to know. If there's problems with anything I believe, I like to find out about that. That's been my motto. If what you believe is true, you should never fear a challenge, because there's got to be an answer out there somewhere. And if what you believe is not true, well, I'd like to find out about that. I've reached the point in this life long ago that I've put my faith in Jesus Christ and my faith in His Word. Section number 2, however, that'll be positive. Positive for both, not just science in general. I should have put positive for good science and positive for faith. The two are mutually enriching and complementary. So let's start with the bad news. Let's start with the negative part. And as I said, I'm giving you a warning ahead of time, trigger warning. This could be disturbing for some people. But I want you to remember, I am a scientist. I still am involved in scientific research. And so I'm speaking as a person who loves science, and I'm speaking from one who's in science, and I'm speaking as an insider here. And so you got to realize I'm not anti-science. I am very pro-good science. So let's begin. Good, solid science, and then not so good. So I want to divide 21st century science into 3 major categories. And the first category I want to look at is what I would call experimental science. And this is trustworthy, and I put an asterisk beside it, because as we'll see shortly, human nature can get involved and be a problem. But experimental science is very trustworthy. This is what I would call good science. It's based on the scientific method. And it can be proven experimentally. That's basically the definition of experimental science. So you have something, you see something, say, I wonder what did that, or I wonder what the explanation for that is. Well, could it be this? Well, okay, that's your theory, that's your idea. Well, let's test that out. Let's do an experiment to see if it actually is that. So you do your experiment, and maybe it doesn't work, so it's back to the drawing board, but maybe it does work, and okay, so I think I know what caused this, and it's that. And then somebody says, wait a sec, I don't think you're right. I'm going to do that same experiment. So they do the same experiment, and lo and behold, they get the same result. So there's accountability in experimental science, because other people can always do that same experiment, and hopefully, if it's done properly, they should verify what you did. So there's a high degree of accountability there. Unless the experiments become so complicated and so expensive that people start realizing, I don't think anybody's going to be checking up on me here. And then human nature can step in. We'll see some examples shortly. Here's an example of what I would call good, trustworthy science, polio vaccine. So, when I was a kid, shortly before I was born, say my parents' generation, there was this disease, poliomyelitis, and it was not a good thing for certain people. I have a friend who got polio, was a little bit older than me, and as a little child, and as a result, he was confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life from polio. But when I was a kid, they found a polio vaccine, and they started it was a needle in the arm. I don't know how many, it was a regular thing. Polio vaccines, I remember we'd all be lined up at school, people would be passing out on the line, not very many, but some. And other people would be coming away white as a sheet. We didn't really enjoy that. Later on, they came up with a better way, I think, to administer that. It's been a long time since I got a polio shot. So I'm hopefully up to speed. I don't know, I should check on that. But you see, this was good science at work. We have a problem, maybe this will solve it. Oh, I think it does. Do tests, do experiments. Yes, it does. It's stopping this. Polio has almost been wiped out. I just checked it this morning. It's still outbreak here and there, but almost been wiped out as a result. That's an example of good experimental science. Here's another example. I used to be an engineer for Pratt & Whitney, and I was in a group coordinating a build and test of experimental aircraft engines. So the engine that I worked on we called it the PW100 at the time. It later went on into the Dash 8, the ADR-42, and a number of other commuter airlines, turboprop airlines. But in the development stage, I personally was there when, 2 or 3 of them exploded in the test cell. You don't want that happening on an airplane. So what we had to, so that's experimental stage, and that's what I was involved in. And so we say, okay, we got a problem here, how can we fix that? One of the main problems was the containment of the power turbine blades. Well, let's make it we need titanium and we need this and that, and then we run the experiment, we'll deliberately blow up an engine see if that titanium containment ring holds the power turbine, and yes, it does. It's past the experiment stage now, we've verified this thing works, and I've actually flown a number of times on aircraft that have the very engine that I helped develop and I personally saw explode. And so why would I get on the aircraft? Because I think good science was involved. So by the time it was finished and certified, we're not going to have the same problems that I witnessed in the early stages of development. That's good science at work. Remember that when people say, well, you don't believe in evolution or macroevolution, oh man, you're anti-science, look what science has done for us today. Well, wait a sec here. Let's talk about what kind of science. We're talking experimental science here, a big difference from some of the other things that are dressed in the guise of science. So the first category is experimental science, that's trustworthy. The second category, what I would call, is inference science. That can be problematic. This is where you begin with an experiment or evidence, and then you take a leap. Because you can't prove the result. In fact, you can't get the result because due to the nature of what you're looking at. So, but you have a good solid basis, then you take a leap. Now, some of those leaps are very small. That leap we might call an inference. And so, for example, this is what I mean by an inference. So, let's say, for example, the Leafs win their hockey game next week. And then they win the hockey game the week after that. They win 2 games in a row. Some of you might be saying, hold on, you've lost me already on that. But an inference would be, okay, they won this week, and then the very next week they won that week. I'm beginning to see a pattern here. If you draw a line through those 2 points and extend it, they're going to win the week after. And if we extend it even further, they're going to win undefeated all year, and they're going to win the Stanley Cup. But if you extend that line even further into the years and the decades that follow, the Leafs will be undefeated for decades at a time, every game of victory. That's a huge leap. That's a big extrapolation. If it was just a small leap, that wouldn't be so bad. But when you start, the further the leap, the more sketchy and shaky your conclusion becomes. Forensic science is an example of inference science. But it's an example of science where the leaps are very small. So you accumulate your evidence, and boy, that evidence is sure pointing here. It's not proof, but it's evidence, to use Logan Gates' phrase from last night. And it's a very small inference. In fact, it's an inference to the best explanation. The other one, that's the most rational conclusion you could possibly draw. That would be forensic science. And it's the kind of science that will stand up in court under very close examination. That's pretty trustworthy science there. Not so trustworthy, macroevolution. So we observe that we can get a variety of dogs, for example. So with breeding programs, we can get a wide variety of dogs. Or Jacob, looking after his father-in-law's sheep and goat herd, noticed he can get a variety of markings on different sheep and goats. And so the inference, a huge inference is, well, what if there's no limit to that variation? And so I have a paper here where we have descended, some people would infer, we have personally descended from sponges. So the sponge has a certain amount of variation capabilities, but over time, that variation is unlimited, and next thing you know, here we are this morning, after a long period of time and numerous things. So the inference, the extrapolation is massive. That kind of conclusion, problematic. And I think problematic might be being generous here. And then there's a third category of 21st century science, and I would call that science fantasy. It's not just me that's calling it that, as we'll see shortly. And that would be not trustworthy at all. It's basically made up, not testable. That's why the scientific method can't be applied here. And the multiverse, for example, would be one example of science fantasy or science fiction. And we're going to see that I'm just not saying that out of thin air. I can refer to one of the, probably the most prestigious science journal in the world that had an article on this. Lawrence Krauss's universe from nothing. It is a theory that is based on another theory, and you can't test this. And at that point, we can take English words and we can loop them all together to make a really good novel, like Lord of the Rings, for example. But just because we can connect all these words together and fabricate this amazing story does not follow that therefore it's true. We can do the same thing with mathematics. You can take mathematic rules and principles and you can string them all together and create models that have nothing to do with reality. And this is part of the problem that's being pointed out by some top scientists. Origin of life scenarios. How did life begin? Okay, completely, what if it's this, and what if it's that? What if it's from space? What if it's from clay particles into the ocean? What if it happened? And these stories are basically fabricated. We have not been able to verify any origin of life scenario up to this date. Now, I want to look at more detail these three categories. First of all, let's look at experimental science. Properly practiced, it is very trustworthy. It's one of the most trustworthy things human beings do because of the high level of accountability, and it is reproducible. And I would, in my experience as a scientist, I am not aware of any aspect of experimental science that conflicts with the Bible. Because there's no inference here, there's no leaps being taken. If you don't believe it, you just do the experiment, there it comes, and it's just I find it beautifully consistent with the Bible, because we're not getting involved in our inferential leaps. But there is a problem. Even here, there is a problem. The pressure of academic advancement and competition for funding have resulted in a huge corruption problem, even within laboratory science or experimental science. Nature. Nature, for those of you who are not familiar with science journals, is probably the most prestigious science journal in the world. If you can get published in Nature, it's kind of like winning the gold medal at the Olympics. That's about as high as you get. Begley and Nails in 2012, they published an article where they looked at a number of landmark papers in the area of cancer research. Landmark papers, not just any paper, but landmark papers, and they found that 89% of those could not be reproduced. Now, was this just an anomaly? 5 years later, same journal, Nature, publishes another article, and here's a quote from this. And in the summary, in the beginning, you're reading sort of like the opening paragraph summarizing what the latest findings are. And the latest findings, numerous studies, most recently in psychology and cancer biology, have confirmed that failure to replicate published findings is the norm. Now, what they're talking about here is experimental science. But these are incredibly expensive, incredibly complicated experiments, and consequently, it costs a lot of money and time to see, can we reproduce that? But these were landmark papers. This is important cancer research stuff. And so they sent out these papers to other labs, independent, to see if they could verify this, and they could not in most of the cases. The word the norm means that more than 50%, this is normal. This is normal, that peer-reviewed papers in many disciplines in science journals cannot be replicated. It's not because there's a problem with the scientific method, there's a problem with human nature. And they come right out and say it's academic pressure to advance in your, for tenure and so forth, or for prestige in the academic world, but there's also competition for funding. And you will find that some of the greatest areas of corruption are in the areas where there's the most massive amounts of funding available, because everybody wants a slice of the pie. So even here, with high accountability, we have a problem. Now, if we have a problem in experimental science where there is high accountability and somebody else can run these experiments and say, wait a sec here, we're not duplicating your results. If we have a significant problem there, then you had better think long and hard about putting your faith in the inferential category of science, and even longer and harder about putting your faith in areas of science that can't even be tested. There's no accountability whatsoever when you suggest yet another multiverse theory. Here's what the current literature says, and I just took articles from just this year, since April. Some of these are like the top ones. Severe figure manipulation found in studies from leading plant lab, that's in Nature. Here's number 8, 35,000 papers may need to be retracted for image doctoring. These are scientific papers, 35,000 may need to be retracted because the images have been doctored to support what they're doing, or what they... just this past week, a senior professor at one of the top universities in Canada emailed me, because I had emailed him an article, one of these articles. And he said, in his university, a PhD student came and says, my degree, I can't get a job. I won't get a job with my degree. This is in the sciences. And my friend says, why? He says, because, and the senior internationally distinguished scientist at his university, according to the grad student, says, he tells us, all the PhD students, he gives us the experiments, he tells us what results we are going to get, and then we do the experiment, and then he fabricates and manipulates everything. None of the results that we're publishing, actually we can do in the lab. He talked to the vice president says, don't rock the boat, don't rock the boat. This would be like a huge scandal for one of our top universities in Canada. I think the word is getting out though, because recently I've heard there is some behind the scenes efforts to straighten things up. Anyways, this is not just, I could tell you other examples here of this sort of thing. But my point is this, if this is the case in an area of science where results can be tested to see if they can be reproduced, we must exercise great caution in accepting scientific conclusions that cannot be tested and cannot be reproduced. Especially, I give an example here, scientific narratives about the past. And I use the word narrative on purpose. Because a narrative is a creative story when you don't have the data to support your facts. Remember, as a PhD student, I was working on a paper to submit to Science Journal, working with my supervisor, and near the end, you know, you always want to wax eloquent about how great your research is and what this might do. And so I said, and this suggests that. And my supervisor says, suggests, like, have you got the data to back that up? No. Well, then take that out of your paper. Right on! Like, I like that. You know, there's not, I said, but they do this all the time, and I was referring to evolutionary biology. He says, we don't do that in biophysics. And I like that. I really like that. It just, you know, no suggestions. If you don't have the data to back that up, get that out of your paper. That's good science. Good. No narratives, no creative storytelling, just the facts. Now let's move on to inference science. This occurs when we take good, solid, reproducible scientific results and then make extrapolations, inferences, assumptions, some small, some substantial, to cover areas that we cannot reproduce in the lab or in the experiment. So you simply cannot do this. You can't reproduce this. And so you extrapolate to that. I can't reproduce what the results of next week's Leafs game will be. I can't reproduce that ahead of time. But I can infer what it might be. I can sort of extrapolate by connecting the dots. If they lost 2 games in a row, probability is, you know, all sorts of things. The results in inference science, they range all the way from very reliable. For example, I give you an example of forensic science and how it will stand up in court. Very reliable, all the way to nothing, hardly more than creative storytelling with a few facts at the beginning to put a basis to this large creative story. And a major problem here in inference science, you remember how laboratory science or experimental science, there's a high degree of accountability, so if somebody starts making stuff up, you can actually go back and test it like Nature did in that article and say, wait a second, 11% is really good solid cancer breakthrough things, but then we've got this 89% problem over here. And this is a huge problem that science is very well aware of now. If you read these journals, they're very well aware that we have a problem in experimental science, and they're working on it. But knowing human nature and its creativity, it's not going to be solved by tomorrow afternoon. But now we have inference science, and when you have inference science, the accountability is dropped, and this is where scientism moves in. Scientism, you run into whenever you hear someone who believes or says that science explains everything. Scientism is not science, it is atheism, and it's atheism dressed up in a lab coat. That's what scientism, yet it's rampant in 21st century science today. Result is that science absolutely must come up with a natural explanation for everything, no matter the cost. And I use no matter the cost on purpose here. Because sometimes in the stuff that I read, there's a blatant, flat-out ignoring of some of the things that, let's say, Marcus Ross will be talking about later. For example, I was back in mid-1980s, I was at UBC. And cover story, I think it was Time or Newsweek or both, cover story is, they had looked at the placentas of women from all different ethnic groups and found that everybody in the world was descended from one woman. Cover story. There was a picture on the cover. And so she began to become known as mitochondrial Eve. So, okay, then the next question is, when did she live? And, you know, lots of explanation. You know, ask guesses 125,000 years ago or whatever. So then they did, over the next number of years, started looking at the mutation rate in mitochondria. And so a number of years later, I saw an article in Science and where they were publishing the first results, and they said, now we've looked at the mutation rate, and it looks like mitochondrial Eve lived 6,000 years ago. The sentence didn't end there, though. It says, of course this is unacceptable, and, you know, forget that. We got to go back to the lab here, and so things continued. I don't know what the experimental science says on that now, so I don't know. But you see, that's not experimental science. There's a certain amount of experimental science, and we can determine the mutation rate right now in our environment. But then there's the extrapolation, the inference. Has that always been the same? Have there been any events in the past that radically increased mutation? We simply don't know, and you have to infer. That's where things get a little bit shaky. But the result here is science, was that it will produce bad science when addressing things that nature actually didn't produce. For example, the universe. And I believe that the Bible states that God created life in its various forms. And so if you have inference science trying to come up with an explanation for not just the origin of life, but how we got our major different kinds, because a divine option is not on the board. It's not acceptable, not up for discussion. It's going to be forced to come up with other explanations, and those explanations are not going to be very good science. Here's an example, number 1, evolutionary storytelling. So I got this article, and I see this so much all the time that I started having a folder and I put evolutionary biology articles in that are illustrations of what I see. This was just a short article entitled The Origin of the Very First Species and the Start of Darwinian Evolution. And I started highlighting what I call lack of data words. These are words that you use in a scientific paper or article when you don't have the data, so you put these words in instead, like presumably, probably, possible. These are the actual words in this paper. There were a total of 28 wishful, I call them wishful thinking words as well. Because you don't have the results, you can't do the results, you do your inference, and you don't even have the data to back up what you're saying, so you use these words like possible scenario, could have, proposed, over time, eventually generated. The phrase eventually generated is a phrase you use when you haven't got a clue how it got from B to A. So with enough time, things happen, and there you go. You've got your desired results. And the things happen part is said like eventually generated or over time. Researchers believe. There's another one, same article. Researchers believe this. Or it seems likely. Or it's conceivable. I can conceive some pretty amazing things, but it's conceivable, incidentally coincided, potentially survived. Now, my point here is not to make fun. I think whenever we're involved in these discussions, we should be gracious. My point here is to say, like my supervisor did, have you got the data to back these words up? No. Well, then you take everything out that has to do with all of this. And if you did that in this article, you got nothing. Nothing in the end. So this is rampant in this kind of literature. That's example number. Example number 2 is an example where it's scientism at all costs. So anything but God. So Eugene Koonin, highly respected evolutionary biologist, to his credit, crunches the number and concludes that the probability of the origin of life is so small, we cannot expect to see it occur anywhere in the universe. That's his conclusion. Now we have a problem, because God is definitely not an explanation in his mind for how. So what he invokes is an infinite number of universes. His conclusion is that therefore, there has to be an infinite number of universes, and if you've got an infinite number of universes, then anything with a probability greater than 0, you can have things that are wildly improbable, but they will occur, and they will probably occur an infinite number of times if you've got an infinite number of universes, and we're one of, like say for example, if you want to win the lottery, and buy just one ticket, chances are you just wasted your money. But if you buy all the tickets, you're going to win, except it's going to probably cost you more to buy all the tickets. So it's, but this is the point. And what I see here is an appeal to an infinite number of unseen, untestable entities that are pure fiction, as we're going to see shortly, in order to avoid invoking just one unseen entity. Occam's razor appealed to the simplest explanation of the work, says you should probably go with the one unseen entity, that is, there is a mind behind life, rather than appeal to an infinite number of unseen entities over here. But that's an example of anything but God. Scientism at all costs. Then there's example number 3, which is an unwarranted extrapolation. So it's a scientific fact that variation within species occurs. You can have a litter of puppies, you look at those, they're not all identical. Extrapolation from that is, well, let's assume that this variation is unlimited, so that all the plants and animals could have originated from just one simple organism. That's the extrapolation. And so in science, if you use the scientific method, you can actually, so far, okay, this is a legit theory, okay? Let's explore the idea that we've all descended from one simple cell. Now, in a scientific method, the next thing you're going to do is make a prediction. What is the key prediction you're going to have to make as a result of this? The key prediction here is that variation would have to be unlimited. There are no limits to variation. Now let's go to the lab and we can actually do that. And for the past over a century, in every selective breeding experiment to date, we hit a wall. And the wall is not because we ran out of time, it's just because there's natural limits to biological change. And so what that does is it actually falsifies the key central prediction of large-scale evolution. If every experiment to date, and the most recent one would be LTE, the long-term evolutionary experiment, just it became obvious, and I've got their summary paper here, that eventually they felt they had explored every possible option for E. coli in that environment. And this is as far as it's going to go, and that was after 60,000 generations. So further time is not really going to show anything new. We've hit the wall at over 60,000. But so Darwinian evolution in normal science, in good science, that the large scale stuff, small scale stuff, natural selection within species, you know, and that sort of thing, that's legit. You can actually run your experiments, take a load of dogs, drop them off above the Arctic Circle, anything from Great Danes to these little Chihuahuas and everything in between. Do that in the fall, come back in the spring, you'll see that certain ones aren't around anymore. And so that's natural selection at work. And eventually, if you let that experiment run long enough, you're going to wind up with what's called the wild type dog. Something that's more closely, looks more like a wolf, able to live in cold weather, able to hunt, not too big, not too small. You'll end up with that. It all goes back to stabilizing a wild type. But scientism must be true at all costs. So it doesn't matter that it's been falsified. If I discuss this, I mean, they don't like it. And so one evolution biology prof says, you're right. I mean, this is true, but it's the only game in town. It's the only game in town simply because the idea that God might be behind the origin of life, absolutely unacceptable, not even up for discussion. And so that's what I mean by scientism at all costs. And unfortunately, it has massively affected science today. The last category is science fantasy. This occurs when scientists make up a theory out of whole cloth that cannot be tested scientifically. For example, the multiverse. That would be example number one. This idea you may have heard, it sounds amazing, it's like science fiction, that there's all sorts of universes out there, not just this one, and they spawn other universes, and so forth. And if you have that would explain why this universe here is so incredibly fine-tuned to be able to support life. In fact, that is the reason the multiverse. George Ellis points this out in another article in Nature, that the reason why we have gone with a multiverse is that we notice that the universe appears to be incredibly fine-tuned to support life. And when you see the neighbor down the street win the lottery every week, and not just one lottery, but all the lotteries every week, all the time, you could say, well, there must be an infinite number of universes, because if there was, there would be one universe where the neighbor down the street does that. Or you could say, somebody is tampering with the lottery system over here. That's more likely. There's an intelligent intervention at that point. Well, that's not an option under scientism. The only other option is that there's an infinite number of universes. And this was the foundation in how the multiverse idea was born. It was to explain away the fine-tuning of the universe. Example number two, Lawrence Krauss, the universe from nothing. Now, it's not actually completely nothing at all, but he misled the public and seemed to be quite happy to let them run with this idea that it came from absolutely nothing at all. But in his theory, you still need a dynamical set of quantum mechanics, which we don't really know what those laws would be. You need some sort of time within which the dynamic laws can work. And so it's not really from nothing. These certain laws of physics at play as well. It's not from nothing. You still have nature, this aspect of nature causing that aspect of nature here, but it doesn't help us explain where nature came from in the first place. So in another article in Nature, Ellis and Silk, this is a different one that I just mentioned, and it's called Scientific Method Defend the Integrity of Physics. They say the scientific method is actually at stake here when you're talking about these things like multiverses and the universe from nothing, because this is not testable. This is science fiction. In fact, the word fantasy was used in another article. This is science fiction, or it's fantasy, and we can't test it, and it's actually defending, or defeating, or threatening the integrity of physics itself. We need to get back to the scientific method to testability, falsifiability, verifiability. Bottom line, 21st century science, and that's what I would call modern science. So when people say modern science has done this or that, I would say, well, wait a sec, it's experimental science that has done this. Modern science is much larger than that. Modern science does not hold the moral high ground when it comes to truth. So some people look at the Christians say, can you trust the Bible? And the assumption they make is science is impeccable, completely. You could take a blind leap of faith in science and it's well placed. total unquestioned. No. This question also needs to be leveled at science. Can you trust science? What I'm suggesting here, that trusting science, good science is one thing, as long as you don't have competition for funding and academic advancement, polluting the papers being submitted to journals. But good experimental science is good stuff. But it's not just that. In reality, it has become a mix of good science, bad science, creative storytelling, science fiction, scientism, citation bias, huge media announcements followed by very quiet retractions, massaging the data, exaggeration for funding purposes. That's a big one that and outright fraud. But I realize I warned you ahead of time. This first section will be disturbing if science is basically your God. Because what I've done here is I've shown that your God, if science is your God has serious, serious problems. Properly seen, science is just a tool. And following the scientific method, it is beautiful. It's a beautiful tool. And we need more Christians practicing good science. We need more Christians who are scientists. We don't need more Christian scientists in this religious sense, in the cult sense of the word. We need more scientists who are Christians. Now I want to get to the good news here. There is good science and it points to God. Science confirms, for example, that the universe had a beginning. And now they might argue about when it occurs, but all I need to hear is, do you say it had a beginning? Okay, you have a problem then, and I'll show you why the problem is here. If you're a subscriber to scientism. And that's why Lawrence Krauss wants to have a universe that explodes into existence of absolutely nothing at all. But not only that, science has discovered that the universe is incredibly fine-tuned to be able to support life. To the extent that it obviously seems to be a creative mind behind the universe with a purpose for the universe. Thus we have, if you're involved in scientism, the multiverse to try and explain that away, an infinite number of unseen, untouchable entities. So I made this little video. Here's a little summary of my next point. What is it that brought the universe into existence? Let's imagine that this tin here represents nature. In it we could put biological life, our solar system, the entire universe, and if the multiverse existed, we could put that in here as well. Basically, everything that's dependent on some form of space-time, matter, and energy and controlled by laws of physics could be represented by this tin, which we're calling nature. Now, we have a problem. We already know with certainty that nature had a beginning to its existence. I demonstrated that in my last video. So what caused nature to come into its existence? Well, there's one thing we know for sure, and that is nature could not have brought itself into existence. In order to do that, it would have had to exist before it existed, so that it would be in a position to bring itself into existence. That is a circular fallacy and logically impossible. Let's imagine that this tin here represents the supernatural, which I will define as everything that's not natural, everything that's not dependent on space-time, matter, and energy, and laws of physics. Now, we may not know everything that's included in this option, and we're quite sure we don't yet know everything that's included in this option here. But there's one thing we know for sure. Nature did not bring itself into its existence. Now, when we only have two options for the origin of nature, and one of those options is logically impossible, then the other option, no matter how uncomfortable we might be with it, is necessarily true. Logic dictates, therefore, that the cause of nature must be supernatural. Of course, that does raise a few more questions. For example, could it be that, poof, nature just simply exploded into existence completely uncaused by anything at all? Another question is, if logic dictates that the cause of nature must be supernatural, then what is the cause of the supernatural cause? These are great questions, and I will look forward to addressing them in my next few videos. In the meantime, please check. Okay. So that was a little logical argument as to why the supernatural logically and it's logically necessary that the supernatural exists. Now, there's no Bible verses used in there. Cold hard logic, which is itself another foundation of science. Some science students, I've run that by them and say, well, if logic says there has to be a supernatural thing, then we need to set that aside. And so you can't set logic aside. You can't even have a conversation if you set logic aside, and you cannot have science, because science is built on logical inference. So cold, hard logic dictates there is a supernatural realm or foundation for nature itself. What does science say about biological life? Well, all of life contains enormous amounts of digital information encoded in its DNA. The only thing science has ever observed that can produce significant levels of functional or meaningful information is an intelligent mind. Now, I know the creative stories say, well, maybe over time we get enough of this, that, and the other thing, we could have, monkeys type up Shakespeare. Maybe. Okay, well, you can crunch the numbers and see what the probability is, and you find that the probability is so small, it's probably never going to happen in the history of the universe. But this isn't just a matter of typing up something so simple as Shakespeare. When you look at what's included in the DNA, you've got, in fact, there's a video by Craig Venter where he wheels a trolley full of volumes of it. He says, this is actually my information encoded in my DNA, and it's a trolley full of volumes. We find that basically you can do experiments, you can run computer algorithms to see whether nature can produce information, meaningful, significant quantities, whether the computer algorithm can simulate that happening, falsifies it every time. There's only one thing on the table when it comes to producing large amounts of functional information, that is minds, intelligent minds. That's the only option science has to work with today, but under scientism, it's not even on the table, so they take the only thing on that was on the table, and what do you left? Nothing except creative storytelling. Conclusion, the fingerprints of an intelligent creator are all over the DNA of life. Here's a little video of molecular machines. You need sound for this one too. Engineers are working on nanomachines. We're talking machines of that scale, and it is a huge problem working with things you can't even see with your eyeballs, and you can't even see with a normal microscope. They are so small that it's just amazing from my perspective as an engineer that all of that is going on in your cell. Machines so incredible they don't even need a motor. It's just that they run because of the physical chemical interactions, like cars with no motors, but because the interaction between the tires in the road, they just propel themselves. This is highly sophisticated technology. Makes us look like we're still in the Stone Age when it comes to building machines compared to what we're seeing in here. Unbelievable. We could do a whole hour on this and you'd just be carrying you out on stretchers. Like, it's so amazing. Miracles in science, I want to talk a bit about that. If God has and continues to intervene in this world in a supernatural way, there will be events that science will find it impossible to explain. And if it tries, it will draw totally the wrong conclusion. And I want to use the example of Jesus turning the water into wine. In that account, and by the way, Gary Habermas has looked at over, I think it was it 3,000 or 30,000 papers, I think it was 30, maybe 3,000, thousands of papers in the academic world to see what the scholars unanimously agree on, and there's near unanimity on this one, that Jesus performed feats that the people of the day interpreted as miracles. They're not saying he actually did miracles. The scholars mostly are secular, but they'll admit, look, we're not saying he did miracles, but we are saying that he performed feats that appeared to be miracles. And not just your normal illusionist that comes into town and pulls a rabbit out of the hat. The kind of miracles he did was to, make lame people walk. You'll never see an illusionist who make a blind person see, unless that's a plant in the audience that's not really blind, but the real deal. So he turned water into wine in a matter of seconds or instantly, we don't know. Let's say it took 1 second. He turned water into wine. Water is H2O, so let's analyze that scientifically. Good wine takes about 2 weeks to ferment, another few weeks to clarify, get all that stuff out, and then it's not good wine yet. It takes about a year to, properly age. So if this wine was made in 1 second, or where do we have a problem? Jesus made good wine from water in seconds or less. Science would say that the wine shows solid, irrefutable evidence of being a year old, over 30 million times as old as it actually is, if it took 1 second for Jesus to make it. So there's problem number one, is that you're trying to come up with a scientific explanation for something which was, there are scientific explanations out there how to make wine, but that's not how this batch of wine was made. This was made totally different because God intervened. And it's not like Jesus is trying to fool the scientists and make it look like it's a year old. No, it's just a requirement for good wine. There's going to be certain properties in it. Here's another problem. Wine requires carbon compounds, but there's no carbon in water. It's just H2O, hydrogen and oxygen. There's no carbon there. But scientifically, it's possible maybe to make carbon by splitting the oxygen in atoms. So to get carbon would require nuclear fission of the oxygen, forming the water, resulting in a thermonuclear holocaust. End of wedding. So if you were told that a person totally subscribed to scientism, you say, look, your belief that Jesus turned water into wine is totally bogus, and here is why. There'd be just a smoking glass crater half the size of Israel where that event occurred, if it actually did, because he would have had to do nuclear fission. Well, I'm not sure Jesus is constrained by using nuclear fission to create the carbon atoms. If you can feed 5,000 people with just 2 fish, 5 loaves of bread, and have 12 basketfuls left over. So looking for a scientific explanation is obviously the wrong way to go. I think there is definitely merit when you see a purported miracle, definitely merit to say, is there a scientific explanation for that? That is a good thing to do. You just don't say, oh, it's a miracle for everything. That is the proper place. But you have to realize at the end of the day that if a miracle actually occurred here, any scientific explanation you're going to have, if you are able to fabricate one, will be wrong. And it will be, not only that, it may highly suggest that that miracle couldn't possibly have occurred under the laws of nature at least. Bottom line, and I see Christians do this, they'll read a miracle in the Bible and then they'll look for, they'll say, well, you know, maybe the parting of the Red Sea was a big wind and it went all night long, and maybe it was, except for the part where it says it seems to say the water stood up like a wall on either side of them. That's really, you gotta have a very strong wind for that, so strong that it would blow those poor Israelites halfway to Saturn. The moment they hit that wind. That, I believe that was a miracle. And so we have to, there's something subtle behind that, because many Christians feel if a miracle, what you read in the Bible is more credible if science can explain it, but that's falling into scientism again. Scientism says you have to have a scientific explanation for that miracle. I say, do your investigation, that's good. But in the end, if that's not working, this looks like a real miracle. It's, at some point, a Christian must put their faith in the Bible as the Word of God, as trustworthy, more trustworthy than narrative science or scientism might construct in its extrapolation and interpretations and inference of the past of the universe, or of how life got here, or other miracles. So there's actually a fine balance here between practicing good science and putting your faith in scriptures. Now, I put my faith in the scriptures. There's a point in my life when I say, I believe this is the Word of God. I do not put my faith in my interpretations of the scriptures. That's a different ballgame. Anybody who thinks they're infallible needs to had a little chat with the elders, I think. But I test my interpretations in Bible studies, for example. That's the beauty of small group Bible studies. I'll say, well, it looks like it's saying this. What do you think of that? Somebody will say, well, but what about this verse over here? And is that consistent with what Jesus said over there? And that's kind of a mutual accountability in our interpretations. But always hold your personal interpretations with, okay, it looks to me like this, and here's why I think that, because I think there is, I mean, you have to be able to defend what you believe from the scriptures. But when it comes to what the scripture says, I have to accept that. That's a faith step that I made at some point. And then I put more faith in the scriptures than I do in 21st century science, which is heavily infected with human nature, scientism, and so forth. Concluding thoughts, all science's contributions to humanity, I mean all of them, every last one of them, have been of the first trustworthy experimental type of science. Every one of them. I can't think of one contribution science has ever made that was outside of that. It's all solid, trustworthy experimental science. Now, even if an inference was involved, eventually you were able to test that inference and you're back to experimental science. Conflict between the scriptures and science arises not from experimental science, but it arises in this latter two categories when science merges with scientism and assumes, interprets, extrapolates, and even fantasizes anything but God as an explanation. Putting our faith in modern science is naive due to the new additions to modern science, like scientism and the frailties of human nature in competition for funding and academic advancement. Good science is our tool to find out how nature works as best as we can. We may not always, we probably will never find out everything about nature, but it's best. Honestly done, it glorifies God and it can move us to worship. That's just a reference to my blog post where I address a lot of questions. And like Brian said, any questions you have, he's given you the way to text those and we'll respond to those tonight. That concludes my presentation.